We welcome at today's roundtable Career Ambassador David Hale, whose final position at the Department of State was Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the highest-ranking career position at State. Ambassador Hale now is the Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Wilson Center. As the Middle East lurches from deadly crisis to crisis on an almost daily basis, there well may be no more knowledgeable or better qualified expert to share with us his insights into that Levantine tinderbox than Ambassador David Hale. Having entered the State Department in 1984, shortly after graduation from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service over 40 years ago, Ambassador Hale has served as ambassador to Lebanon, to Jordan, and to Pakistan, as well as Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Earlier in his career, he served tours in Tunisia, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, and here in Washington, he was Director for Israel-Palestinian Affairs before ascending to Deputy Assistant Secretary for Israel, Egypt, and the Levant. Ambassador Hale has just published American Diplomacy Toward Lebanon, Lessons in Foreign Policy and the Middle East. Ambassador, our council is doing its part to contribute to the sale of your book, recently having purchased a number of copies in connection with today's roundtable. For those wishing to obtain a copy today, which Ambassador Hale has indicated he will happily sign, Joyce has a few in hand available at the price which the council paid to Amazon. Yesterday and into last night, Israel struck at Rafah, the final stronghold of Hamas in Gaza. Hamas rocket fire this week killed 4 Israeli soldiers, triggering the shutdown of a border crossing important for food supplies to the beleaguered Gazan civilian population. American university campuses are in violent turmoil, presenting domestic political complications, with our national elections a scant 6 months away. Hamas apparently has indicated willingness to accept terms of a ceasefire that Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu categorizes as inadequate. But nonetheless, Israel is dispatching a negotiating team to further discussions. With this witch's brew prevailing, Ambassador Hale joins us to share his many years of Middle East experience and his insights into the threatening regional volatility. Ambassador Hale, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, and thank you for the invitation to join you. Thank you for the lunch and this opportunity to be at this beautiful club and the chance to renew friendships and relationships with many colleagues who I worked with, particularly during the Trump administration. And of course, unfortunately, the Middle East is so quiet, there's nothing to talk about, so we probably can move quickly to coffee. But I'm pleased that you connected my bio to current events, not because I bear responsibility for the current disaster in the Middle East, but I certainly know how we got here, and I have some ideas on how to get out of it. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is because Lebanon is a mirror or a window into the Middle East. And I'll come back to why that is the case. And so when you start to write a book or discuss Lebanon, you end up talking about almost everything that's going on in the Middle East because it has some dimension of Lebanon connected to it. So it's a wonderful way to open up a conversation about the whole region. Why I wrote it really was because Lebanon has been a big part of my life. I had 3 tours there. And you as political appointee ambassadors know that, or may know that, Foreign service officers are usually told never to go back to a country they served in because, for different reasons, it's not necessarily career enhancing. And I did the exact opposite. I had 3 tours in Lebanon as a young political officer when the Civil War ended, as the Deputy Chief of Mission to David Satterfield during the heyday of the Hariri period, and then as the ambassador under Obama. And I did the same in Jordan, by the way. I also had three tours in Jordan. So I have some expertise in 2 tiny countries. But why they're important, of course, really is because of geography. And those of you who may not know Lebanon, I'll give you a couple of data points. It's an old nation, but it's a new state. It's geographically the size of Connecticut. It has the population of Tennessee today. And it is a vertical country in the sense that you can go from sea level to 8,600 feet in a 45-minute drive, snow-bound mountains. And it also is a country in which 18 different religious communities, and I'll use the word sect, by that I usually mean religious communities, who are all jealously guarding their autonomy and all want a piece of power in the central government so that they can use that to defend themselves or project power. And they all seek relationships and alliances with countries outside who they think they can manipulate or take advantage of to counter threats from within Lebanon, from other communities. It's a place where the cross currents of religion, language, culture, politics, ideology, everything you can think of has cross currents through Lebanon. And it's, as I said, a microcosm of the region. It's also a place where great powers come into conflict. Just north of the American Embassy, there is a place that narrows, the road narrows between the sea and the mountain, where it's the only way you can cross north-south Lebanon. And troops marching through there started laying plaques. And the first plaque was laid by Ramses II in the 13th century BC, one of the pharaohs. And you can go through, there are a whole bunch of plaques, all kinds of leaders, the Persians, the Romans, Europeans, the French. And finally, there's a plaque where the Lebanese themselves, in 1946 on independence, were able to lay their own plaque, no doubt hoping it would be the last one. But my point is, this has been a place where the great powers have come into conflict or have used Lebanon to protect their allies, to battle their rivals, or to, as an object of desire for itself, for its assets and resources. And this is something that is age-old history, and it's not going to change. What I found in writing this book, and I kind of knew already this was going to be the theme of it, is that for the United States, our attention really was first directed in a geopolitical or geostrategic sense with World War II. Lebanon has always been of interest to us for other reasons apart from Lebanon, because of these larger conflicts going on in the Middle East. And I found a quote. Jimmy Carter was having a dinner with Anwar Sadat at Camp David. They were waiting around for Menachem Begin to agree on something. And Sadat asked Carter about Lebanon. What's your thinking about Lebanon? And Carter said, we don't really have a policy toward Lebanon. We just want the crises to stop long enough so that we don't have to deal with them, but we don't want to get too involved to really solve the underlying problems. And Carter was right. That is an absolutely accurate description of US policy through many, many periods. And of course, it's one which has contributed to many of the problems that we have encountered in Lebanon as a result because of this oscillation of our attention. I call it oscillation because you can say peaks and valleys or spasms of interest. Well, we'll get very involved. There's something that's going on, usually because of another country, Israel, or the Cold War, or our battle with Iran. We'll get very, very involved, and then we hit a wall because it's complicated. And we drop it like a hot potato, in the phrase of one of our envoys to Lebanon, Phil Habib, a great Foreign Service officer and Lebanese American. We drop it like a hot potato, and then we go away for a decade or so. And in that period of neglect, a lot of bad things build up. And our rivals are able to establish their influence and have it grow. And that is a story of Hezbollah today. And I can elaborate a bit on how that came to be. But it's in those periods of neglect where the danger is the next problem is festering. So I would advocate not for the peaks of intervention, but to avoid the valleys of neglect and find some steady involvement where we're never absent, where our expectations are in check, they're within the realm of the reasonable, but we're persistent, and we make sure that we're countering our rivals. Now, there's 6 episodes in the book, and I won't touch on each of them because I really want to get to Q's and A's, which are always more fun. But I will talk about the starting point, and then 2 chapters that relate very much to current events today. The starting point, those of you who know our history know that FDR, even before we entered World War II, met with Winston Churchill off of Newfoundland on a battleship and agreed to the Atlantic Charter. And that was one in which FDR very enthusiastically and Churchill, with a noted lack of enthusiasm, agreed that ending imperialism, even imperialism by our allies, was an objective of the war. And I think Churchill had his fingers crossed behind his back, but he did agree to this. And the first test case of the Atlantic Charter was actually in Lebanon, because when de Gaulle rose to be leader of the Free French, Lebanon was in a very complicated position. There were British troops there, but the Free French were in charge politically, but they still had a lot of Vichy French actually on the ground. And the United States had certain desires, but we didn't have manpower. So our power only went so far. And de Gaulle was telling the Lebanese, yeah, we'll give you independence, but then when you looked at the fine print, it was anything but independence that they had in mind. Continued French troops, continued French access, continued French decision-making on their foreign policy and security policies. And we had an ambassador there. He wasn't called an ambassador, but the head of mission, who was a guy named Wadsworth. And he had been a professor of chemistry at AUB, American University of Beirut, missionary school originally. And he had something called clientitis, which I think all of you have heard of probably in our service. He cared passionately about Lebanon, but in the right way, not in a way in which he put Lebanon's interests above American interests, but he saw the nexus, where our ideals about anti-colonialism and our rhetoric was being stymied by de Gaulle, and that our actions could overcome that. And he worked behind the scenes. And our system at the time was dominated by, the Near East Bureau was split, and the French-speaking posts were dominated by career officers who were very close to the French. And their careers had been shaped in Paris and the many consulates we had in France. And so they instinctively veered toward de Gaulle. Whereas Wadsworth, this guy with a Lebanese flavoring, pushed it in the other direction. And it hit a fuse, the right kind of fuse in the White House. And we were able to bring about the independence of Lebanon behind the scenes by pushing and cajoling and getting Churchill on our side. And it was a really powerful moment, which many Lebanese are unaware of. Now, the more current chapters that have resonance to what's happening today in Gaza really relate to the 82-84 period. As you may recall, Ronald Reagan sent in 1,400 Marines, largely to extricate Israel from overreach. The Israelis had a very ambitious strategy. They felt that their moment was ripe for them. Having made a peace agreement with Egypt, they no longer feared an all-Arab war against them, so they wanted to pick them off one by one. And they saw that Arafat was vulnerable in Lebanon, and so they launched a war to try to basically push him out, and also to push the Syrians out, who were occupying much of Lebanon and were an enemy of ours and of Israel, and to put in power a pro-Israeli president in Lebanon who would be prepared to sign a normalization agreement with Lebanon. Very ambitious agenda. It misunderstood that the power of Israel's military could not be translated into power of political change in an Arab capital. And they ended up mired in the mud. In the United States, Ronald Reagan agreed to a military strategy to bring peacekeepers in with the French and with the Italians to allow a cushion so Arafat could be evacuated. But then, unfortunately, we had promised the Palestinians that we would protect their civilians who were left behind. And unfortunately, there was a massacre. The IDF was partly complicit in of thousands of Palestinian refugees, which brought American troops back, but without a mission or a mandate. And so we were there basically becoming protagonists in this war. But I go back to the starting point, which was overreach. If the Israelis had had a more limited agenda of just focusing on Arafat, we might have been able to get away with it. But we also had problems internally. And in the ending chapter of the book, I talk about three sets of problems. Problems with ourselves, problems with our friends, and problems with our enemies. And in that instance, one of the areas that was problems with ourselves was bureaucratic infighting. And Reagan's inability, great as he was as a president, to referee disputes in his national security team. So you had George Shultz, who was very much engaged in trying to get that normalization agreement between Israel and the Lebanese done while our Marines were there. And you had the Secretary of Defense, Weinberger, who didn't want the Marines there at all. And he certainly didn't want them to be put in harm's way. So we never had the military mandate to do what Shultz wanted, but the Marines were still in harm's way, in the worst possible situation. And all know how that story ended, with 240-some Marines being assassinated in an explosion by Hezbollah. And that was the moment that Hezbollah started to gain power. And another lesson learned from that moment is that not only did Hezbollah, with Iranian backing, blow up our Marine barracks, they also blew up not one but two consecutive American embassies with massive loss of life. What did we do? We actually did nothing. We did a lot of rhetoric, Reagan made a decision to launch a retaliatory strike against the Iranian training facility in a remote part of Lebanon, but it was never carried out by the Weinberger Defense Department. There's a lot of back and forth in the memoirs and in the archives about who is to blame and whether Reagan really made a decision or didn't make a decision, but the fact of the matter is, we did nothing. And if you wonder why, as we sit now looking back 40 years to 1984 and wonder why Iran and Hezbollah behave the way they behave, well, it's because they haven't paid the price for their behavior so often at moments like that, and therefore they have just waited us out. And we did withdraw our troops in the run-up to the election of 1984, and we went into one of those periods of neglect. And we were viewed as so vulnerable and so weak that you saw American citizens, innocent professors, NGO workers, journalists being plucked off the street and held hostage. And again, what did we do? We negotiated for their release. We didn't retaliate. In fact, I had trouble clearing. I have a line in the book which says, we have a long-standing policy, the United States government has a long-standing policy that we never negotiate over the release of hostages, except when we do. And the State Department did not want to clear that sentence because it was an acknowledgement of reality, in fact, and it was embarrassing. But it's true, and it's true up until today, and what we're seeing going on right now as we speak. So that's the lessons from 82, 84. The other interesting period, of course, was 2004 and 6. Again, we had deep presidential involvement in decision-making related to Lebanon, not because of Lebanon per se, because 1982-84 was about Israel, and it was about the Cold War in the sense of Syria and the Palestinians were allies of Russia, of the Soviet Union. In 2004 and 6, we and the French were at odds. Remember, the Senate canceled the phrase French fries, freedom fries. I mean, the French were not helping us in Iraq, and boy, were we mad. And Jacques Chirac knew that was a problem, so he was thinking about where can I find common ground with George W. Bush. And he decided that democracy in Lebanon was the place to do it. Remember, Bush had that freedom agenda for Iraq. Look, elsewhere in the Middle East, where can you do something? And Chirac said, let's try on Lebanon and push for the Syrian withdrawal, which we did. The Syrians pushed back and blew up Rafiq Hariri. But that ignited a revolution, an outpouring of disgust over the status quo, which compelled the Syrian troops to withdraw. A huge victory for the United States and for our multilateral diplomacy. But then, unfortunately, there had been an accidental war, which was started by Hezbollah when they seized some IDF soldiers in the border area. The Israelis had pulled out of Lebanon 20 years earlier. Not 20 years earlier, 4 years earlier. And Olmert, who was prime minister at the time without military background, felt that he needed to have a strong response to that. A war began. And the mood in Washington was very much on the side of Israel in this war, as it was in the Middle East. I was ambassador to Jordan at the time, and the King of Jordan was 100% behind the Israeli move. And we were all hopeful that this would really lead to fundamental changes in Lebanon and defeat of Hezbollah and the Syrians. Unfortunately, as the war lasted, much like we see in Gaza today, it's perfectly understandable why Israel, out of frustration, would want to eliminate a terrorist threat that's casting a shadow over its country. But unfortunately, in an Arab environment, a war like that can build more support for the enemy that you're trying to defeat than the opposite. So you can vanquish it militarily, but you can't necessarily vanquish it politically, at least not without having an alternative. And so we started to offer not advice to Olmert on how to conduct his war, which I do hear from this administration today, but how to conduct the peace. And one of the things Condoleezza Rice observed, and she was the one negotiating this stuff, was that the Israelis never really clearly identified in their own mind or for us what their objective was. I mean, they were bombing everything that moved in Lebanon at this stage, to the point they were even bombing things that had nothing to do with Hezbollah because they hoped to turn Lebanese opinion against Hezbollah, had the opposite effect. And she said, you know, if the Israelis don't know what their objective is, then they don't know when to declare victory. And if they don't know when to declare victory, then they don't know when to stop. So we're going to have to play a role as the United States to help them identify when to stop. What does victory look like? And then she encountered a problem she discovered when she was describing in Jerusalem to the Israeli leadership that the president was tired of this war. He wanted to bring it to an end. And Olmert said, well, that's not what we hear. And Rice, of course, strong personality, she took that on board. She went back. This is the summer of 2004. And 2006. She went to the farm, to the ranch at Crawford, and she challenged the president on this. Said, "Why is he hearing that?" And it turns out Bush said, "I don't know." And they convoked an NSC meeting, and it turns out that Vice President Cheney was telling the Israelis through a back channel that Rice knew nothing about to keep on going. Don't listen to her. Keep going. The president doesn't want you to stop. So the president realized he had a problem, and he came down from his bedroom the next morning with a handwritten note of instructions saying the freedom agenda, there's too much at stake, democracy in Lebanon. We can't allow the Israelis to destroy this country, and we're going to have to help them reach a peace agreement. And that gave Rice the freedom to bring about an agreement. It was very difficult, but she did bring it about finally, which has led to a period of time where there has been an uneasy peace between Israel and Hezbollah, but one in which Hezbollah has been able to rearm. And frankly, if there were a war to reignite at the scale of 2006, I would say that it would make 2006 look like a tea party, because the amount of sophistication of the weaponry on both sides, the scope, scale, and reach of the weapons far outstretches what they had in 2006. So that may be one reason why both sides are a little bit hesitant to move the war into the northern zone as well. I will stop in a moment, but I did want to just touch on the three problem categories I mentioned, problems with yourselves. And one of the problems I also have discovered in my career is that Americans like to look at the world, and particularly the Middle East, as the land of Locke, James Locke. Forgive me if there are any political scientists. I'm about to do some damage to these theorists. But in other words, that there is a land that the world out there is rational, and that the rule of law will ultimately prevail if we just help enough to bring about an understanding of that. But if you're living in the Middle East, you understand you live in the world of Thomas Hobbes, that chaos is on your doorstep every day, and that while they are as individuals, every bit as much capable of enjoying freedom and democracy as anybody else around the world, their societies and their leaders are not, and that is the world that they live in. And so we often fail, I think, to understand that the Lockean solutions that we have really have no real application to the world of Thomas Hobbes. I mentioned consistency and bureaucratic problems already as well. And then we have problems with our friends, the overreach. And lastly, problems with our enemies, which I also touched upon, which is that they are able to outlast us, and they are able to put more assets into these problems than we are, because they're usually more important to them than they are to us. And unless we apply pain to not just the proxies that are making life miserable for us and for our allies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, but they were also applying pain to the source of the problem, which is Iran. And that has been a missing piece, I think, of the last 7 months. I will stop there, and I realize I got a little political, but I am now no longer an employee of the State Department, so I can speak my mind, even if I'm a little rusty at doing that after 38 years of speaking for other administrations. But thanks for your patience.
Thank you. So the first question seems to be coming from Ambassador Stuart Bernstein, and though if you would like to ask a question, please tip up your name card, and you'll be called upon. You'll be called. One quick second, and you'll be called upon in the order in which the name cards went up. Stuart.
Lebanon was called the Riviera of the Middle East. It was supposed to be very special. How did Hezbollah get in there like that? What brought us to this point? And I'm really also not clear on how Russia got in there and what's the latest status of that.
Yeah, I have a vignette in the book. I discovered a postcard that my grandmother wrote. They were big world travelers, and they wrote a postcard the year I was born, 1961, from Beirut, extolling the Riviera and friends of friends taking us to dinner and being out all night at the Casino de Levant and enjoying it so much. That was a reality, but it was a thin veneer. It was a little slice of Lebanon that people are very fond of, but beneath that slice that mostly very well-off people were enjoying, there was another world in Lebanon. And the world of South Lebanon in particular was an area of Shia population. They had been brought into Lebanon. Originally, they were not part of the country. The French brought them in order to expand the economic base of the country, a rich agricultural land. But there were a handful of families that ran the show in the South. And famously, one of them said, I don't need to allow education of my people because my son's getting a college education, so he'll be educated for them. Right? So this was the very feudal attitude that those people had. And there was as the Civil War moved into high gear, it unleashed these forces of rebellion among the Shia, who were every bit as angry at their own Lebanese leaders, Sunni Muslims and Christians, as they were when the Israelis came in. In fact, in many instances, the Israelis were welcomed as an alternative. Also, the Palestinian militias had come in and occupied South Lebanon, and they were calling the show, and they alienated a lot of Shia Muslims. Shia felt that they were like cannon fodder in between the Israelis and the Palestinians. 1979, the Lebanese Civil War had already been underway for 4 years. The Iranian Revolution happened. And the links between South Lebanon and Iran have been historic. They go back years, family marriages, intermarriages amongst families, religious leaders being educated in Iran, and going back to South Lebanon. But with the revolutionary fervor, it really captured that mood of frustration with the status quo. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard sent several hundred trainers into Lebanon. Assad allowed it to happen, the father. He had an uneasy but an allied relationship with Iran as a way to counter the Palestinians, actually, originally. And they started training in a terrorist cell that became Hezbollah. But Hezbollah cut its teeth on the fact that the mood against the Israeli occupation began to grow and grow. And so they started the car bombs. They didn't invent car bombs, but they really developed into a fine art form. And again, it was during that period of neglect that I mentioned, when in the United States after '84 we just gave up. And that was the period when the Iranians and the Syrians used every tool they had to reinforce their power. And what better tool than a militia like Hezbollah, a tenacious tool. On Russia, I don't perceive Russia as having particularly much influence in Lebanon. They do in Syria, but they haven't been able to translate that into really any real say-so in Lebanon. There is a Greek Orthodox community in Lebanon, which is significant, and there is some sort of sentimental attachment between the Russians and that community, but it hasn't translated into geostrategic things. And in fact, one of the things that's happened during the Syrian civil war is that the former tit-for-tat between Hezbollah and Israel in many ways moved to Syria. And Netanyahu, in his memoirs, mentions he went to Russia and met with Putin, and they worked it out where Putin said he would turn a blind eye if the Israelis felt a need to bomb a Hezbollah facility or a weapons transfer inside Syria, they would deconflict.
I meant Syria.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Russia.
Yeah. Well, Syria's been preoccupied. But that's a real fear, I think, if the civil war ends, is what are they going to do? And there are a million, probably close to 1 million Syrian refugees inside Lebanon, which is a major source of discontent among Lebanese because it's been a drag on their economy, which is already suffering greatly.
Ambassador Tan.
Yes. So in response to the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri, there was the Special Tribunal for Lebanon that was formed in regards to his assassination as well as the others who were killed in that same attack. The U.S. invested $10 million per year for that tribunal, and during my watch, the IOSH case came down. He was the primary defendant in that case. The academic literature says accountability measures like that are the best way to prevent future mass atrocities. Do you have an assessment with respect to the Special Tribunal for Lebanon?
Well, we supported the tribunal robustly, as you said, because we wanted, and rightly so, every tool we could have to counter Hezbollah, including exposing its terrorist criminal behavior, were tools that we wanted to exploit. The problem, of course, with a tribunal is that well, let me step back. One of the problems in Lebanon is that crimes and terrorist attacks and so forth with a political dimension have a funny way of never actually being fully investigated, right? And Hezbollah still has arms. They're the only private faction that has arms. And so they can intimidate anybody that they want. Anybody who might be a witness, anybody who might be a judge, anybody who might stand up and call them out. And they have done so recently. They've assassinated critics in their own community. So it takes real courage to pursue this, and we did. But I don't think it has the full desired impact that you mentioned unless we're actually able to expose the reality of their responsibility for what they did. I have no doubt about it. I've seen intelligence, so I feel strongly about that. Also, a process of elimination. No other organization could possibly have had both the motive and the capacity to do what they did. But for it to be effective in terms of Lebanese politics, you have to expose that reality in a way that's credible to people who will not believe that. Because the people who are against Hezbollah are already against Hezbollah. They already believe what I just said. The real battle for hearts and minds is there's a Christian group that sort of wavers back and forth for pragmatic reasons, and then the Shia population itself. So you have to really meet a high level of conviction of the intelligence you have and information that's exposed in an investigation, and we've never reached it. So I'm unfortunate. I think the tribunal's basically petered out, which is a real shame. And if you talk to the Hariri family, I mean, they were putting a lot of money. I mean, we were also asking the government of Lebanon to put money in, which we were able to succeed in doing. Because part of our strategy also, apart from countering Hezbollah, apart from the Iranians, apart from all of that, is try to reintroduce the rule of law and the fact that the state exists and that there's sovereignty there. And it's not just a free-for-all amongst these different militias and factions in foreign countries. And the tribunal could have been an important tool in doing that. Unfortunately, because we couldn't have the smoking gun, it fell short of that goal. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try in future.
So it will be Ambassador Holwell, then Ambassador Dugan, then Ambassador Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want to go to your final comment. What the hell do we do about Iran?
Yeah, exactly. Well, if we had an easy answer, we probably would have already fixed this problem. But one of the things we have to do is identify and expose the reality. And I think that there's a reluctance in this administration, and you can point to others on both sides of the House, that don't necessarily want to acknowledge the centrality of the Iranian problem in the Middle East, because then it leads to the question, what are you going to do about it? And I, again, in my book, and just based on my life experience since 1984, we've tried almost every single thing in the national security playbook, if it existed, to deal with Iran, and none of it worked. We've tried engagement, we've tried isolation, we've tried containment, we've tried, maximum pressure. But one of the reasons why I don't think they ever worked is that we never stuck with it long enough to test whether or not it would work. And maximum pressure, for example, I'm a hardliner on Iran, so I believe in maximum pressure. I could advocate as a professional foreign service officer a different approach, but that's the one I would choose if I was able to make the choice. But we in the Trump administration really had maximum pressure in place from, I would say, mid-2018 to the US election in November 2020. Is that long enough to test whether or not a strategy of sanctions pressure and using every tool you have going to actually bring a regime to change its behavior? I would say no. A sanctions strategy is going to be a long-term strategy. Same thing with Russia today. People say, well, why hasn't Russia collapsed yet because of our economic sanctions? Well, there are lots of reasons, but one of them is you can't judge it by your watch. This is to be something we stick to long enough that decision makers on the other side will change their decisions. And the same thing with all the other strategies. So my first plea is whatever game plan you have, we should be persistent in it. And I would give up, and this is a ridiculously artificial number, but I would give up 20% of my 100% hardline if it bought me 20% bipartisan support in Congress, so the damn thing would last long enough to actually test whether or not it works. And meanwhile, the Iranians have learned from experience, and I gave you some examples. Just wait. You just have to wait for it. We're a democracy. Thank God we're a democracy, but it means that our foreign adversaries who are not Democrats can just wait, because they know in 2 to 4 years there's going to be a new team and a new policy, and then they can deal with that. And right now, for example, you wonder why adversaries in the Middle East are not giving up. It's because they don't have to. They can wait. We have an election coming. What do you expect? They may make tactical decisions that are required to save their skin right now, but their real game plan is just to wait and see what's going to happen in our election. It's part of it. It's part of the equation. And so we've got to overcome that with persistence, information, and a strategy that is as multifaceted and as sophisticated as their strategy to deal with us and our allies in the Middle East is. And we've been falling short on that. So unfortunately, a lot of the Gulf Arab states began to hedge their bets because they didn't really believe in the security umbrella of the United States. Now that's changed. I think what happened, I've forgotten the date when it happened, but what was it, a month ago, with the successful defense of Israel's, against the missiles and drones. And I think that's beginning to show that the American security umbrella counts and does matter. But it should never have happened. It was a test of our will and of the absence of our deterrence that allowed that. So we have to start rebuilding that, which means persistence. and recognizing Iran as a central protagonist. Not the only thing. We have to have strategies to deal with the Palestinian problem, with the Lebanese problem, with the Yemeni problem. We also have one that sees the connectivity of it all, which goes to Tehran.
Ambassador Dugan.
I have to say this is something of a wistful question. I first went to Beirut overland from Basra in a truck masquerading as a bus in 1951.
Wow.
And I remember I wanted to go to AUB to college, and the two things that my parents first told me, of course, it was the Paris, the East, and all these kinds of things. But as a small child, the two things that stuck with me was the fact that they had a Christian president and a Muslim prime minister. And I thought, this is the future. And then secondly, that there was a very, very large Lebanese and very wealthy Lebanese diaspora in the rest of the world. And I wondered if either in your book or in your own thoughts, as something that is just wishful thinking, that I don't even know what's happened and how much of a minority the Christians are now. And then secondly, as the Lebanese diaspora, they've been gone too long, they have given up. Are there factors at all?
Oh, absolutely. They have waxed and waned in their influence, but they have a powerful voice here in our country. The Lebanese American community right now is very unhappy with the state of affairs in the Middle East and with the policy, and they're speaking out on that. And while they probably, if you did a poll, there are probably more Democrats than Republicans in the community, there's some very prominent Lebanese American Democrats who I know are saying that directly to the White House. They also have some influence in Lebanon, particularly when they speak with one voice, and when they're able to amplify a policy that the United States government has set forth. And if it has the backing of the Lebanese American community, that becomes very much harder for the Lebanese to ignore. And we're finding this right now. They have every 6 years, the presidency is a one-term presidency. So at the end of every 6 years, they have a crisis over whether the guy wants to extend, because the seat apparently has glue painted all over it, or a new president to come in. And so they've had a vacancy over this, and it's agitated the Lebanese American community a great deal. So they're traveling a lot and speaking to leaders there. They also have a role to play in humanitarian assistance and philanthropical work. A lot of philanthropical business in Lebanon is actually sort of hidden politics, whereas the Lebanese American community come in with more altruistic objectives. When I flew there after the port explosion in 2020, Pompeo asked me to go out, and I brought with me a bunch of COVID supplies that and a subsequent plane load had been paid for by Lebanese Americans. And so that was a powerful message of support. But one thing that happens is, Lebanese, when they leave Lebanon, go to the tops of their professions wherever they are. They sparkle. I mean, they're incredibly educated, talented, dynamic people. When they're in Lebanon, something seems to go wrong. And the infighting is incredible. And even in the Christian community is probably the most fragmented of any of them, partly because they're more democratic in their inclination, but also because there is a psychological element, the Christian mindset, political mindset, in which many of them view themselves as a minority that should make alliances with other minorities. And the other big minority in the Middle East is the Shia population. And they view the Sunnis as allied to Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and therefore the enemy. Somehow this big problem is trying to absorb them. That's, I think, a miscasting of the real situation, but so many Christians actually believe that. And that has led to alliances between powerful Christian factions and Hezbollah, because it's this misguided sense that even though they're devils who have the same interests as we do in protecting ourselves against the Sunni Muslim onslaught. And particularly when the Syrian civil war was spewing out Daesh, ISIS extremists into Lebanon who were blowing themselves up at checkpoints when I was ambassador there, that was very much the uniting force between the Shia and the Christians. So we did, as the United States government, everything we could to ramp up support for the Lebanese army to put a stop to it so that we didn't experience a further fragmentation of the state. But I wish I was on that trip with you in 1951. It would have been fun.
Ambassador Hughes.
Thank you. I suspect that around this table, your suggestions that we pursue policies that avoid overreach and are based
realistically in like the Hobbesian realities of the Middle East that exist, not the Lockean world we wish to exist, this finds a lot of resonance. And the foundational idea for realistic approach, we said, would frankly persistence at the beginning and at the end in respect to Iran. But Ambassador Gilmore has just come back from Taiwan, where he gave a keynote address on the topic of can America lead in a fractured world? And I'd argue that his title might better be, can a fractured America lead in a fractured world? So how does a fractured America achieve persistence?
Well, absolutely, which is why I did make the observation I would give up some of my hardline approach if I knew it would bring more moderates on board to a strategy that we could stick to. So I think there has to be, again, a common sense realization that neither extreme probably has the full answer. And as a country, we may be more successful when we cater to the center. But you know, I also look back on history, as you can tell from this book and my talk, I love history, the history of diplomacy and foreign policy. And you know, we were more often fragmented than we weren't. I mean, you've all read the histories, you know, I mean, right from the very start, you know, are you on the side of the British or the side of the French in the Napoleonic Wars? And that was the dilemma that George Washington faced right from the very beginning. And it was deeply fragmenting. And by the way, both Britain and France interfered in our politics in order to try to get us to lean one way or the other. And the same thing in our Civil War. I mean, the major objective of Lincoln and Seward as Foreign Secretary of State was to keep the British and the French out because there was a real risk they were going to come in. They succeeded, but it was a close call in some instances. So, you know, the decision to enter into World War I was not an easy one either because of the ethnic mix-up of our country, right? Those were real factors for Woodrow Wilson to think about, the German vote, the other communities in our country. And so you really only had a strong consensus, in my view anyway, because of the Cold War, and the stakes were so high in the nuclear age that it compelled common sense moderation, even if there was hot air here and there. And then when that collapsed, you again had this, because the stakes were not perceived as being actually so high that we could afford the luxury of fragmentation. I mean, I often comment that if we were a small country and behaved this way, we would be dead.
Absolutely.
But fortunately, we're a strong country and we can survive even our own mistakes. And our strengths lie not in our politics per se, but in three things. It's the strength of our economy. It's the strength of our military, which is a factor of our economy, and it's the strength of our democratic values, which include the free debate and of ideas and open conflict, so that you don't have, you know, civil wars all the time. You openly discuss these things. Those are the sources of the strength of our foreign policy and diplomacy in our nation, and we should never forget that. And as long as we're attending to those three things, the details will work themselves out.
Ambassador Oliver, and then we'll conclude with Ambassador Graham.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Along with the idea of persistence, I assume you're talking about maybe we shouldn't be giving the billions and billions and billions of dollars that the administration seems to be helping to flow towards Iran. What I want to ask you about actually is Jordan and the Abraham Accords. What role for Jordan in this current Middle East crisis? And what about the Abraham Accords? Do they exist or not?
I think the Abraham Accords has been one of the great triumphs of the last 5, 6, 7 years. I also think that they've proven that they're resilient enough to survive even it's hard to think of a greater test than what it's going through now, and it has survived that. And I think the Biden administration has done a good job in tending to those relationships, and also keeping the door open to a Saudi-Israeli deal, which seems to be the next one. Unfortunately, unfortunately in the sense that it's more complicated, the Saudis will probably require a higher price be paid to the Palestinian cause than would have been the case before October 7, because the politics of the region have become more polarized. Jordan was miffed, is the only word I can think of, by the Abraham Accords, just for really the wrong reasons. They felt that they were being eclipsed and overlooked for the sacrifices that the king and the Jordanian people had made on behalf of peace, starting with the peace treaty in the mid-90s. And that is a misleading thing. We've given them enormous amounts of help and assistance, but they felt that they were kind of being, as I said, eclipsed by the new era. So they also had a problem that King Abdullah and President Trump did not have a very, very warm relationship, as the king has had with many of the other presidents. So I see now with this latest trip, there's an effort to repair that. One of the advantages of listening to the King of Jordan is that he's a friend, he's an ally. His stability and future success is linked entirely to ours. And so his advice is worth listening to. It doesn't mean he's always got the right answer. But he's talking now about a need to pay more attention to the Palestinian diplomatic set of issues and humanitarian issues. And I would say when we talk about persistence as well, I was witness to this. I mean, we were in the Obama administration's first term, we gave it our all to try to reach a two-state outcome. At the end of that, was exhausted. I wanted to walk away from that file and never look at it again. John Kerry came in office. He wanted me to stay. I said, no, you need fresh eyes. And he tried for a year, and he couldn't do it. And we have tried everything we could think of to bring about a two-state outcome, and it hasn't happened. In the post-October 7 environment, it's going to be even harder. But the point I'm getting to is that from John Kerry till today, we basically did almost nothing to actually look at the Palestinian problem. And I don't think you can neglect that. I'm not saying we should snap our fingers and expect a two-state. There's got to be fundamental change in attitudes by the populations, much stronger sense of willingness to see to Israeli security on the part of new Palestinian leaders. We're not there. But we can't neglect this and not expect crises like what we've seen to erupt. So that would be, my guess is that is what the King of Jordan has been saying during his recent visit here in Washington.
Thank you. Final question to Ambassador Graham, who's encouraged to
follow.
follow.
In advance, you may have covered part or all of them about to ask. My hearing is not superb, but I did pay very close attention, so I'm not sure. So if you just could give me a brief answer on 2 points. First, do you think it's realistic to believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu is interested in peace, ever wants to have peace, ever wants to have a peaceful Israel, because they know that he knows that will lead to the revival of the criminal trials that he may have to face if he's out of office. How realistic is it? And second, how realistic is it that our president has told Netanyahu that if he doesn't do things to protect civilians, we're going to stop military shipments to Israel? And last night I read in the newspaper that, I don't know if it's true, it's just a comment in the newspaper, that Biden had said that he planned to stop ammunition shipment.
Well, there's a lot of material there to work with. Let me start with your last question on U.S. military assistance. Obviously, we have laws in our Arms Export Control Act and other vehicles that require us to monitor closely the use of our weapons. I don't know the facts. This has come up in the past, obviously, and it's very pertinent and relevant to have the debate today, but it does need to be fact-driven by what we discover, if there had been any abuse of U.S. weapons for human rights violations or other aspects of our laws, then it's up to our political leadership to speak to that and then act. If we're contemplating, if someone in the White House or elsewhere is contemplating cutting off military assistance because we're unhappy with Israel, which is different than what I just said about abusing violating our laws, if it's because we don't like the policies that they've adopted, that's another thing. And I have to say, your question triggered in my mind, having had to sit as a witness in an impeachment hearing, that was exactly what Donald Trump was accused of and impeached for, was suspending or threatening to suspend military assistance to a foreign government because he wanted a certain policy course taken. So Congress will take a different view, potentially, if the administration wants to use aid as leverage that way. Congress has a very different perspective. Now, when it comes to Israel, you not only have the fact that Congress has its own prerogatives and believes that if it has voted assistance, the president doesn't have a choice. The president is supposed to then provide that assistance. But there's also going to be, I think, strong pushback in our country, even if right now today, the last poll I saw is a few weeks old now, but after a long period of suspended judgment of the Israeli operation, 57% of the American public now believes the operation should stop. The IDF's operation should stop. That's different than attitudes toward Israel. And if you were to ask, I would think it would be important to see public opinion polling on would you support cutting off assistance for Israel? And my guess is that public opinion would not support that. But those are political calculations that would have to be made. I also don't believe that we can really work with Israel and expect Israel to do some of the things we think are necessary that may involve compromising their position if at the same time they don't feel that we have their back. I mean, a fundamental starting point in our alliance and relationship with Israel has been certainty that we will be there when they're needed. They will defend themselves by themselves, but we will provide the means needed to defend them. So that would be a very fundamental change at a moment of great vulnerability in the Israeli psychology, and to expect them then to just change their behavior because we say so, I'm not sure that's going to happen. On Netanyahu, I honestly think that any plausible prime minister, other prime minister of Israel today would be behaving more or less as he is, because the Israeli public supports it. And the October 7th climate is such that I think that the choices that the Israeli society has before it are basically lead to the decisions that Netanyahu is making. Does he benefit from the fact that he's trying to recover his tarnished image by having made these mistakes and having put Israel in jeopardy? Yes. Is he trying to postpone a day of judgment on his cases? Maybe. But I don't think necessarily that means that any other leader would be behaving very differently. I experienced, I worked directly with him for 4 years, and I characterize him in the book as the Israeli prime minister American presidents love to hate. Okay? He's never had a good relationship with an American president. He's always been a problem for us as we try to pursue a two-state outcome. He's never sincerely believed in two states. But part of it's because he doesn't believe that there's a Palestinian partner who will, in a two-state outcome, actually be reliable in defending and allowing Israel to defend itself, and as a Palestinian state, actively moving against sources of aggression toward Israel. And that is the essence of why we failed in the Obama administration, is we were never able to bridge the gap between what a sovereign West Bank and Gaza would look like and Israeli security requirements. That is the rub of the problem. And we had the US military do really phenomenal work to offer alternative ideas on how Israel could feel secure without having a massive troop presence in the West Bank, and they never bought it. They never took it. But that wasn't Netanyahu acting alone. That he was reflecting a mood in Israel today. So we have to change that climate on both sides, both the Palestinian and the Israeli side, because they also ask the Palestinian population, do you believe in two states? And the answer is no. They want one state, their state. So we have a long way to go, and Netanyahu has not been much of a help in that connection, unfortunately.
That's the Gaza's position also.
Thank you.
They want one state,
Yep.
their state.
Yep.
So thank you very much, Ambassador David Hale.